Hey, hello everyone. This is Leo Education webinar. Today we got Lisa again because last month we got Lisa also to have our first SEN webinar. We are glad that we have Lisa and Joanna back for the second SEN webinar. Today our topic is SEN a barrier to education in the UK education system? How can I help my child at home and at school? Hello, Lisa and Joanna, can you hear me?
Hello,
Yeah.
hello, Leo.
Hi, nice to join you again.
Welcome back. Nice to see you again.
All right, good. Joanna, do you want to begin?
Yes, so good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And I understand it's nearly 9 o'clock for you guys, or just after 9 o'clock. So I hope you've all had an okay day and you're ready to join us to talk about a topic which is very close to our heart. So we're Beyond Bridges Education. And we really focus on working with families who have children who learn differently or maybe struggle in some areas of schooling. And my background, my name is Joanna. My background is I have 3 boys, some of whom struggle with learning, and we've had to support through school in Hong Kong and also now back here in the UK. And my professional experience, particularly in Hong Kong, was working in international schools on the admissions side. So dealing with families looking to join the school, maybe dealing with the assessments that families have to go through and seeing some of the struggles that children face. And my good colleague and friend, Lisa Low, I'm going to hand over to her so she can introduce herself.
Great, thank you. And good evening, everybody. So my name is Lisa Low, and I have been in education for nearly 30 years now. I've been a SENCO, so I've led the Department for Learning Support in various schools. I've also been head of school. I've been head of school in a prep school here in London. But also I was a head teacher for a very academic school in Shanghai, in China, and also worked and lived in Hong Kong, where I supported families and children with differences through assessment as well as through family services. I too am a mother of 3 sons, exactly the same age as Joanna, which is how we met at our school in Hong Kong. And 2 of my sons have neurodifferences and have needed various levels of support in education as well. But my eldest, who's 18, is probably off to university for engineering. So his differences have certainly been a gift. But we're very delighted to be here today to talk about special educational needs and to introduce you to a terminology which we are referring more and more to, which is called neurodifferences or neurodiversity. Great.
Start to share our presentation. Can you see that okay?
You just need to put it into presenter mode.
Okay, but that looks
perfect.
That look right? Yeah, great.
Good.
All right, over to you, Lisa.
Okay, so what is neurodiversity and how can I help my child at home and school? We are going to explore a few things, keeping in mind, we can go to the next slide actually, Joanna, just keeping in mind that we have a very short time together. So I'm going to just touch on some of the special educational needs that you might be familiar with in Hong Kong, but also in the UK. As Joanna said, that we are Beyond Bridges Education, and we support family and children with learning differences. Here in the UK, in Hong Kong, we do quite a lot of work in Thailand as well. So either in your school systems where you are currently, or families who are on their way to the UK. Next slide. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about what are the types of special educational needs that you will be familiar with. How do you know whether your child has a special educational need? And we are also going to look at what is neurodiversity. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to explain that concept to you and how you might be able to support your child. Before we begin, what I do need to say, however, is that every child is individual and unique. And although we can provide descriptions of each type of SEN, we must always be mindful that every child will present and learn and think differently from each other. That's just what makes us human. So whilst we will talk about categories of special educational needs, we're also going to be very mindful that this is just a generalization, but every child will be their own person. We're going to do about 30 minutes of talking about these through the slides, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end, where Joanna will help to facilitate some of the questions. So please do use the chat facility to be able to pop in your questions. Last webinar that we did with Leo, we had some fantastic questions at the end, which really helped us to hone in on what specifically you as parents and families wanted to know about. So please do use the chat function for that. Next slide. Okay, so in both the UK and in Hong Kong, we refer broadly to 4 categories of special educational needs. Special educational needs and disability, SEND, in the UK, that's more of a legal term to describe these various conditions that fall under these categories. And those 4 categories are cognition and learning, sensory or physical, communication interaction, and social and emotional health difficulties. As you can see, you might be familiar with some of the types of these difficulties or these differences, such as specific learning differences. That's definitely a phrase that's used in Hong Kong, which refers to the dyslexias, dyscalculias, dysgraphias. The sensory and the physical, it might be physical or hearing impairments. It could be some sensory sensitivities or sensory processing difficulties. Communication and interaction, that's where you would find conditions such as autism, speech and language difficulties, for example, and social and emotional and health. That's where you'd find things like ADHD, so the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, anxiety disorders, and so on. So these 4 categories, they're just used to help us to get a broad idea of where these specific areas of need, how they impact on our children's learning and behavior. The most important thing to remember about these 4 categories is what we know now about the way that these special educational needs work is that they're very overlapping. So it means that if you were to meet a child who'd been diagnosed, for example, with autism, around 40% of the autistic population will also have somewhere between 2 and 4 additional types or specific needs. So you might find a child an autistic child who will also have a diagnosis of dyslexia or ADHD. So despite the fact that we have these 4 broad areas of these specific educational needs, in fact, they're very overlapping. And it's not often anymore in my work that I find children that present with only one condition. So when I started my assessment work nearly 25 years ago, it was very clear, particularly if I diagnosed a dyslexia, it really had to do with reading and writing and spelling, and we knew what to do with that. We knew the interventions that we needed to put in place. But those days have really disappeared. Now I am meeting families who've got a very overlapping situation where a lot of conditions are presenting themselves all at once. And I think there's a reason for that, which we can talk to a little bit in a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay, so specific learning difficulties is really the umbrella term to describe the conditions that begin with dys. So dys is the Greek prefix that means difficulty. Lexia is the Greek word that means reading or the printed word. So the specific learning difficulties is the umbrella term that you'll probably be familiar with in your schools in Hong Kong, similar to UK, but underneath that comes the dyslexias, dyspraxias, dysgraphias, and dyscalculias. The dyslexia, when we talk about, particularly at BBE, when we talk about these various conditions, it's really important to us that not only do we talk about the challenges that may present with being dyslexic or having dyslexia, but we also talk about the strengths. And it's really important today to be able to advocate a strengths-based approach. So we know from research, we know so much more than we did 25 years ago, but we know from research that the strengths of dyslexia include skills such as creative problem solving, being able to think about sort of novel problems, being able to find solutions to them, whereas others may not be able to find them. Big picture thinking. People who are dyslexic learners tend to be able to make connections between things. I often describe to parents, it's that sort of more intuitive ability for our children to think on a scale or on a level that sometimes other children, maybe siblings, don't quite think in the same way. And the dyslexic learners, they tend to have this sort of gap between their ability to problem solve or their ability to use language orally and then the written word or the word in print. So we tend to get these gaps and spiky profiles of our dyslexic learners. But of course, some of the challenges with dyslexia include reading accuracy, reading fluency, spelling and writing skills, so that's whole written expression. The whole idea of expressing oneself in writing involves many, many different layers, including being able to punctuate your sentences, to be able to construct an actual sentence with the correct syntax, to be able to spell the words within that sentence. So it's quite a complex task to do writing in itself. And that is when you really tend to see our dyslexic learners struggle the most. They're just not able to put all of those things that we need to be able to express ourselves in writing. How do I know if my child's dyslexic is often a question that I get from my families. First of all, it's very difficult to be able to know just by observing a child whether or not they present as a dyslexic learner. So one of the things I often ask my parents is, had you had similar difficulties when you were growing up in your primary school education? Often families and parents and carers, they may have not received a diagnosis when they were young, because at the time it wasn't really the thing that it wasn't the practice that was taking place. Today, now in schools, most of our schools, particularly in the UK, and I know as well in Hong Kong, there's a much more greater awareness about dyslexia. So teachers have a better awareness of what to look for in the classroom, which means that more children are being diagnosed as dyslexic learners. But often for families, by even asking the question, is there somebody in the family who had difficulty themselves learning to read? Is there somebody who had perhaps not a very positive early school experience? With dyslexia, most of these symptoms or these behaviors or skills, we do see them in primary school, particularly at the onset of reading. So dyslexic learners have often had much difficulty with the 3 R's. So that's reading, writing, and arithmetic. I also say to parents, it might be that you can't quite put your finger on it. There's something quite puzzling about your dyslexic learner. Like I said earlier, they might have this real ability orally to communicate and have big ideas, but there's this big gap when it comes to actual performance in school. So if you note these sorts of things in your child, that's when you want to be considering whether or not you want to consider an assessment or delve a bit deeper or speak to your school team, because there could possibly be a dyslexic pattern or a dyslexic profile there. And genetics often is a big part of that. Next slide, please. So dyscalculia. Dyscalculia, we tend to see this a little bit less often, although statistically it's still like dyslexia is around 1 in 10, but it's not as obvious as a dyslexic learner is. And the reason for that is because dyscalculia really refers to a difficulty with number. But it's more than just perhaps not being able to maybe retain or remember your times tables. It's really about this deeper understanding of what is the concept of number. And often our dyscalculic learners, they really struggle to understand things like place value. So if they're presented with a number that's got a thousands, a hundredths, a tenths, and a unit, for example, 1,912, they may have difficulty actually understanding that actual concept of that thousand. What is that number holding in that place? So this is what we call numerosity. It's a real challenge with just really understanding the concept of number. A very early example would be if we think about a dot pattern on a dice, for example, the dot pattern of a 5. When we see that on a dice face, most children almost naturally begin to see that as a 5. They begin to see those dot patterns and just immediately their brain processes this concept of 5. Our dyscalculic learners, they're the ones that may need to go back and count again to see that that is a 5. It just doesn't come quite naturally to them. So the challenges that they have are problem-solving skills in maths, that numerosity, that real concept of number, difficulties telling time, understanding parts to whole. So that means that they may struggle with fractions because their brains are just not able to process in the same way that a fraction is a small part of a larger whole, which then impacts telling the time, quarter past, quarter to, half past. It also impacts division as well. So these are the children that tend to have these not so obvious areas of difficulty, like reading and writing, which really presents itself quite obviously, but it's there, and it gets a little bit more challenging because maths becomes a little bit more difficult. But these children are usually very good communicators, both in written and verbal form. Again, lots of creativity and strategic thinking, but they tend to be the children that really just dislike maths, no matter what you do to make it enjoyable. And again, when parents often ask me, how do I know if my child is dyscalculic? I'll ask those same questions. Did anybody or does anybody have similar challenges in your family? We're looking for that slight genetic pattern to see whether or not there might have been a parent who also struggled perhaps in primary school. They'll be very reluctant. These are the kids that do not want to do maths. They're the ones who can sometimes become so anxious before a week of school, knowing that they've got their math lessons coming up. If you feel that your child has any of these behaviors, or there's any traits ring a bell for you, it's really worth investigating a little bit more deeply. The trouble with maths, and again with reading and writing, is it's just very obvious. These are the skills, particularly in primary school, that children begin to compare themselves with each other. Somebody is very strong and fast at maths, another child is not very fast or strong at maths. These sorts of performance measures become really obvious. So for us at BB, it's really important that we're able to support this by understanding whether or not there is a diagnosis there or a condition. Next slide, please. So dyspraxia, so we've got the dys again as difficulty. Praxia is to do with movement. Now, dyspraxia is, again, it's around 1 in 10. And some of the strengths that belong to dyspraxic learners are similar to the dyslexic and dyscalculic. Some real creative and original thinking styles, a lot of strategic and problem-solving ability, very highly motivated, again, can solve these novel problems that other children may not be able to solve. The answers don't come as naturally to some children, but to these children, they might do. The challenges, however, have to do more beyond movement. You tend to see difficulties with dyspraxic learners, again, in their earlier phases of life. So you tend to see children who never really were able to master doing up buttons. They might have trouble still doing zips. They certainly would have trouble probably tying their laces. And then you might see children, dyspraxic learners in primary school middle years or primary school to middle years, where they don't engage in sports very often. They might do single sports, but they might avoid team sport, because the team sport involves quite a lot of spatial awareness about where they need to be on the pitch or on the field. So tend to see children who tend to avoid sport, even though they may have some sporting ability themselves. They're also the children who will really struggle to organize their thoughts on paper. They'll really struggle to be able to plan for a goal, for example. If they knew that they've been given a task in class and the teacher said, you need to have this task completed by this time, they're the kids who will really, really find it difficult to find out, what is my timeline? How am I going to reach that goal? Because that ability to motor plan, to be able to put sequences together, is really challenging for the dyspraxic learner. Again, how do you know if you've got a child with dyspraxia? Well, same question I would ask: is there anybody in the family who had similar or shared experiences to the child? Is your child a child who engages in sport? What kinds of sport do they engage in? Are they reluctant to engage in any physical activity? Were they late to reach any developmental milestones like crawling, walking, tying shoelaces, doing buttons? How about their fine motor skills? All those sorts of things can give us some idea about whether there is a dyspraxia present in your children. Next slide, please. So dysgraphia. Now, dysgraphia is to do with difficulty with the written word. So graphia is the actual idea about writing. And we tend not to use this as a diagnosis anymore. We tend to use it under the umbrella of specific learning difficulty, with difficulties in written expression. And that also includes things like punctuation and the actual ability to write. So once again, some of the strengths that are involved with children who might present with dysgraphia: great communication skills, good listening skills, they've got very good recall, there tends not to be any particular memory difficulty, good storytellers. I should say most of these kids with specific learning difficulties are determined and resilient, because oftentimes they've had to sort of prove themselves or overcome significant barriers. The challenges tend to be very obvious with dysgraphia. These are the children who really struggle with the printed word. They really struggle to write. You'll see difficulties forming letters. They'll always kind of have incorrect letter formation, difficulty spacing their words and their letters on the page. There'll be inconsistencies in sizes and shapes. And again, they just won't be able to organize their writing in an effective way that's able to communicate what they truly want to be able to say. Same sorts of questions I would ask families. Is there anyone in the family who's had similar challenges or shares some experience as the children? And you will definitely have a reluctant writer. It'll be the child who will avoid or try to escape any written kind of task that they have to do. You'll also often see, particularly in the younger years, and again, more in adolescence when there's more writing and content that is expected of children, where you'll see a lot of handshaking as well. So there's lots of little behavior cues that you can look for if you think that a child might have some difficulties with writing. Next slide, please. Okay. So what tends to be the trend, particularly in Hong Kong, is we're probably seeing a bit less of the specific learning difficulty diagnosis. Not to say that that is means that there's not children with specific learning difficulties. However, what we're seeing is a rise in diagnosis for autism and ADHD, which we'll talk about in a second. And the reason for that is, again, ADHD and autism, they tend to be more externalizing. particularly in the boys, they present with more externalizing behaviors. So for a classroom, for example, and for a teacher, these behaviors are just much more obvious than maybe some of the hidden behaviors that are associated with some of the specific learning difficulties. So we are seeing a rise in the diagnosis all over the world, actually, with autism as well as with ADHD. The other thing and reason for that possibly is because, as I said earlier in the presentation, is that there's this comorbidity, there's this overlapping nature of these conditions. So as I said before, up to about 40% of children with an autism diagnosis are likely to have between 2 and 4 other diagnoses as well. So we have to kind of keep this in mind when we're now thinking about special educational needs and thinking about children's learning profiles. No longer do they really exist in silos. Those days are really gone, particularly in the work that I'm doing. When a child comes and a family comes to us, really the child's presenting with a number of those categories of right across the whole board. And what we do as a team is we sort of help that family to untangle some of what we're seeing in front of us and the behaviors that we're seeing, particularly around learning and also around social behaviors, to say, okay, well, where does this all fit in? But autism spectrum condition is some of the strengths that are associated with that is a fantastic attention to detail. Again, with autism, we tend to think of autism as what we might be seeing in on TV or in movies, but actually autism is a very heterogeneous condition. It means that if you've met one autistic individual, you truly have met only one autistic individual, because every child is different in the way that they think, feel, and behave, particularly those autistic children. So some of the strengths that you might see is this great attention to detail, this ability to hyper-focus, incredible memories, logical thinking. I put STEM there because they tend to have strengths in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. They'll sometimes have an ability to have a real niche area and a very high interest, which they can return to time and time again. They'll know a lot very deeply about a particular subject that most people won't know about. Oops. Some of the challenges, however, are a little bit like the flip side of all those things. So whilst it is a strength to be able to be very attentive to detail, it can also present as a vulnerability because it means that there's a lack of flexible thinking. And when there's a lack of flexible thinking, it's quite challenging to get by daily, for example, in the classroom or at school or within the family system. So some of those strengths can also be vulnerabilities because they can also limit and perhaps create barriers, particularly for an autistic child within the environments that they are learning in. Again, how do you know if your child is autistic? I should say with all of these, it really does take diagnosis and a team of experts to be able to work with you to be able to provide that diagnosis. But again, you might be looking for some of these traits and characteristics in somebody within the family. You might find that your child has always had has had difficulty trying to make friends, but also to maintain friendships as well. They may have sensory sensitivities, so that means they could be hypersensitive to certain sounds. For example, and these are some of the questions we ask is if a child's in an assembly at school, that they might need to cover their ears just because the sensory stimulation that they're getting auditorily is too much. They may have food preferences because they may have some sensitivities around the color of food or the texture of food that they like. They might have some challenges in learning. And again, what you might see is this overlap with, for example, dyslexic patterns as well. What we do see in autistic learners is what we call emotional dysregulation. That's when our children become really highly emotional to the point where they're not able necessarily to regulate themselves. They're not able to calm their nervous systems without some support, usually from the adults who care for them. over time, these things can be taught and children can learn ways to be able to help regulate themselves. But often for autistic children, the overwhelm, particularly from the environment, the sensory environment, causes this level of increased emotional dysregulation. And oftentimes it's very hard for them to be able to regulate themselves. And usually it's our children who, it's difficult for us to understand why, but they just don't seem to always fit in. They may find it a little bit difficult socially to be able to sort of get on with the social world. Next slide. Okay, ADHD profile. So one thing to know about with ADHD is there's 3 presentations for ADHD that's used in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Diagnosis. And that is the presentation where it's inattention. So you've got children with an ADHD presentation, but they have difficulty alerting their systems. They're inattentive rather than externalizing. They tend to be more internalizing. They're sort of harder to detect, but they're the children who often in class, the teacher will say things like mind wandering or daydreaming or just not able to initiate or start a task. These are the children that might present with the inattentive ADHD. Also, we've got the hyperactive, so the impulsive ADHD presentation. So those are the children that usually are the ones that are always getting in trouble at school because they've got so much externalized behavior that teachers usually tend to lose patience with it because they're the ones who interrupt others. They're the ones that need to get up from their seats in the classroom. So that's the second presentation. And then the third presentation is a combined. So you've got some children with ADHD who have inattention as well as impulsivity. So it's hard for those children to inhibit their responses. So there are numerous strengths that we know of that because the ADHD community has grown and grown and grown, and in particular on social media now, it's something that is very much shared and spoken about in terms of people's lived experience of ADHD. But certainly these are our entrepreneurs. They're the creatives, the imaginative people, they're spontaneous and energetic. These are all the strengths that can be associated to children with ADHD. Of course, all of those things, like autism, are also vulnerabilities because we know that in certain environments, like the school environment, it's difficult if you've got a child who is spontaneous, who is getting up from their seats all the time, who's creative and imaginative, just needs to get their ideas out to the teacher. So this is what can become a little bit more challenging when they're trying to get on into their social systems, such as in school. Again, how do I know if my child's got ADHD? Same sorts of questions. We'd ask whether or not there's somebody in the family who might recognize or share some of these traits. One of the biggest indicators for ADHD really comes from the teacher. It's oftentimes that the ADHD is often in trouble at school. They're often being asked to be sent out of the classrooms. They're being asked to sit down, they're getting detentions. They seem to always be getting in trouble just because of this level of impulsivity. And often we can see these behaviors right early on now, from about 18 months old, actually, is some of the research where we can see this your child, particularly if you're presenting with the impulsivity or their hyperactivity, where you can see just your child doing a lot of movement all the time, not really being able to focus for very long on any one particular thing, but flitting and floating. So it's really difficult in early stages because of early developmental stages. That's expected of children of that age. But by the time they get to school, if some of these behaviors haven't necessarily been regulated, that's when you tend to see, and that's when it can impact the children at school. Next slide, please. Okay. So despite having shared with you all those various special educational needs, what I'd like to talk to you about at this point is this term neurodiversity. So neurodiversity simply means that all brains are different. Neuro refers to our nervous systems. Diversity refers to the very natural range of differences that are amongst all of us. Neurodiversity is a real it's a very popular terminology that's particularly used in the UK now, because it's created this kind of paradigm shift in that we're moving away from thinking about all these special educational needs as being more of a medical model, something that is deficit in our children. These differences mean that our children are different to the norm. Neurodiversity embraces that, well, in fact, all of us think, feel, and behave in unique and individual ways. So for us at Beyond Bridges Education at BBE, what we really firmly believe is that every person, every child thinks, feels, and behaves in individual ways. And what's our job and what we are trying to promote is that we need to look at our children from a strengths-based perspective. We need to see what it is that they can do and that they do well. And then we can also look at what are some of the challenges that we're noticing in the environments that our children exist in. The neurodiversity movement suggests that, well, in fact, it's the environments that need to change. It's our school classrooms, it's our family homes that need to develop an understanding and awareness about how our children learn and how individual and unique they are, so that we can adapt and change our environments so that our children can thrive within these environments. So it's very much from a strengths-based model, and it's very much honoring the uniqueness of each and every one of our brains. Next slide, please. And one of the core principles that we believe in, and this as well comes from the neurodiversity movement that we're all experiencing now, is that having a learning difference does not hinder the path to success. We've got many, many stories where we've got children who autistic children or ADHD children, dyslexic children, where we've been able to work with the families to develop an awareness and understanding of how their children thinks, feels, and behaves. Then working with the school teams to be able to understand how to best support those children within those classrooms and in those school systems, so that child can be their best selves. And it truly is this process that really means that every child can succeed, despite having a difference in the way that they think, feel, and behave in the world. Next slide, please. So how can I help my child at home? Well, it's very difficult to be able to provide all the recommendations that we tend to provide to our families, which come from the assessment and the reporting. But there are three fundamental pillars that we use that are really important for families and for school teams to be able to acknowledge. And our key pillars are neuro-enhanced awareness of how our your child's learning differences, how they think and feel and behave. The neuro-enhanced adaptations. So these are the real practical, gentle, and flexible strategies and adaptations that can be made both at home and school. And neuro-enhanced advocacy. And that pillar is extremely important because it provides an opportunity to have your child's voice heard so that they feel seen and heard and understood. The reason we call it neuro-enhanced for our 3A model, awareness, adaptations, advocacy, is because we know so much more now about how children's brains and how all of our brains develop. We know so much more about how our social experiences have a huge impact on the way that brain development takes place. We have so much greater awareness about how so many of our brain systems are connected, and how our bodies and brains respond to things in the environment, such as stress. So it's really, really important, this awareness piece, for families to consider assessment, particularly assessment of their children's learning profile, so that they feel equipped and they've got the language and level of understanding and awareness about how their children think, feel, and behave. Part of that is also their own awareness, because oftentimes what happens when we work with families is that families begin to understand their own systems and how that impacts upon their child as well. So the awareness piece is a really important piece. Once you've got that awareness of how your child thinks, feels, and behaves, which may come from a diagnosis, or it may not come from diagnosis. One of the things that we are all pushing for in this field is that we no longer really need to wait for diagnosis to be able to put support and intervention in place, because we know so much about how learning takes place now. We know so much about all these different neuro differences. So we shouldn't have to wait for diagnosis in order for all of us, families, children, to be able to support your children. Neuro-enhanced adaptations, these are just very practical and bite-sized adaptations and accommodations that you can make both at home and at school. So it might be something as simple as understanding that your child processes information more slowly than others. So that might mean I only going to give my child one instruction at a time. It might mean in the classroom that the teacher might give 3 instructions, but she might, or he might also attach those 3 instructions with a visual prompt. Next, so it could be now we're doing this, next we're doing that, then we do this, so that the child has a visual prompt as well as an auditory prompt to help them process the information that they're receiving from the teacher or from an adult working with them. Another simple adaptation could be that, for example, eye gaze. We know from all the research and brain research that when we meet our children on a horizontal level, we're able to give them, we're able to gaze into their eyes, that we are triggering some biochemical responses in our children's brain. We're creating some additional fantastic, what we call neurotransmitters, feel-good neurotransmitters, to allow our children to know that they are psychologically safe, that we are tuning into what our children want to say to us, whether verbally or non-verbally. So even something simple, for example, adaptation would be if we have a child that is struggling with their emotions and is quite emotionally dysregulated going into the classroom, what we might say to the teacher is, when the child next comes to the classroom door, try to get to their level, look them in the eye, and again, not intensively, but allow them to know that you are tuning into that child so that that child can get that response from you and be able to feel safe in their environment. And you start to see a much greater balance of emotional regulation with just very subtle things that can be done both at home and school. Finally, neuro-enhanced advocacy. This is an approach that we use, which is called a team around the child. The importance of building a team around your child is huge. And this is something that really we take, this is a great part of our work, because parents of neurodiverse children cannot go alone. It is really difficult to be able to manage your school system, the communication with school, at the same time as trying to support your child in terms of their neuro differences. So it's really important to be able to build a team which includes your school teachers, the school Senko, your family members, and any external therapists that are involved in your child's education, to be able to build this team so that you can collaboratively work together to solve any problems that might be occurring. Next slide. Okay, so just going into these a little bit more deeply, with the awareness piece, again, we do this through assessment or through screening measures. So sometimes your schools may have some tools that they use in your school. So if you are feeling that your child's progress and performance is just not on track, you've recognized some of these behaviors at home, and you're beginning to feel a little bit puzzled and confused about your child's progress, then it might be that you can speak to your class teacher. And if your class teacher also observes these things in class, it might be that she can refer you on to your SEN department or learning support department. And your learning support department, they may have a few measures themselves that they're able to use to be able to detect and pull out some of these behaviors. This is an important step, and it's an awareness piece. It means that you may not have a diagnosis, but just knowing where you are currently and where your child is currently is really important. For example, we know that behavior, particularly externalizing behaviors, the ones that we tend to see in the classrooms, they have a function. And behaviors, they're there to tell us something about how a child is feeling inside their bodies and their brains and body. So we tend to think of behavior as either an escape or a avoid behavior. So sometimes you want to, if you see a behavior, if your teacher sees a behavior in a classroom, and they might say your child is behaving in a certain way, or you might begin to question, is it because they're avoiding something that is not easy for them? Are they trying to escape a situation that is not making them feel psychologically safe? So there's many things that you can begin to ask yourselves once you have an awareness and a deep understanding of how your child learns. Okay. Again, with the adaptations, I just talked about that, so I won't go into it today, but we've got a whole list of recommendations when we're working with schools and families. But again, that comes from the awareness. Once we understand what's happening for your child, then we're able to think about what are the interventions or the strategy or the very simple adaptations that we can make to better support your child. Next slide. And finally, we just talked about the team around the child. This is a really important piece. And in fact, a lot of our work, which may start with assessment with the family, does end up in this space where we're really engaging the school team as much as possible to be part of this solution, to thinking around how can we solve the problems that are currently happening for our children. Okay. So two of the things that we offer, which might be of interest to some families who are in that position where they're thinking, there's something different about how my child learns and behaves or thinks, and I'm just not quite sure what it might be. So we offer a screener, a free screener, and it's the Strengths and Difficulty questionnaire. So this is something that's actually a published measure, and it's an online measure that can be used. And what it does is it has a look at children's emotional symptoms. It has a look at maybe any issues, particularly around conduct or behavior. It may look at attention and inattention as well. It also has a look at some peer relationships. And it's basically a 25-itemed questionnaire that you as a parent could fill in or email us and ask and fill it in, and then we can just help you to interpret it. It's by no means a diagnostic tool, and it should never be used as a diagnostic tool, but it's an information, it's a data gathering tool that again helps us to think about what's happening for this child at this moment in time. So that's a facility that we offer, but it's possible that your schools may offer something similar. Next slide.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have, yeah, you've talked a little bit about the second one, and then this is the first item that that we can share with families if anybody's interested, which is just in detail a little bit more about the individual neurodivergences and the strengths and the challenges that that we've gone over a little bit today, but sometimes it's really helpful to have something in writing when you're discussing with your teachers or with your partner or even with your child. So this is also something that you could reach out to us and we can share with you.
And actually, Joanna, something you just made me think about there is oftentimes we often hear from our teachers about what our child cannot do and some of the problems that are being faced in the classroom. And sometimes when you are equipped with it, with information like this, with the sheet, it's sometimes nice to ask your teachers, what can they do? What are their strengths? What do they do well? Because oftentimes that gets left out in a busy classroom.
Yes, exactly. So let me just see. So this is just a screenshot of the screener that Lisa was talking about. So the process that you can go through, and we can then help you to interpret a little bit the behavior that you're seeing or that your child and your teachers are seeing. So those are two things that you can reach out to us if you'd like to find out a little bit more. We're really happy with the opportunity that we have through Leo Education to talk about different topics. Obviously, we haven't finished talking about this topic yet, but the next one, for anybody who's interested, is going to be around dyslexia and reading and writing. So that one is already planned, I think, for the 11th of June. I think Leo will be kind enough to share all the details of that with families. And then I just wanted to share different ways that you can contact us. So, we can share this afterwards, but please feel free to take a photograph or, to note down these informations. We are happy to communicate via WhatsApp. And then the QR code here in the middle is just to our inquiry form. So if anybody wants either of those resources, then please just fill out that inquiry form. We'll send it to you. And if you wanted to send us a bit more information just by email, there's our email on the screen there. So hopefully that's helpful. And now maybe I'll just stop sharing my screen. And then if anybody has any questions, we've got one question in the chat, which we'll come to. But if you have any questions, please do just type them in the chat. Or if you want to, we're very, very friendly. And we are very happy to talk directly. So if you want to put your camera on and just ask us a question, then please do. So I'll just stop sharing now. And I wanted just to come to the question that we had from Happy. So she was talking about her son who's been diagnosed with dyslexia several years ago. So he's 11 now, and he was diagnosed when he was 6. And he's always struggling with reading tests, spelling tests, but he's extremely good at listening and communicating. So can we give any effective techniques to help with spelling?
Yes. So there are many, it depends really on what's available probably at the school in terms of any dyslexia support. But there are many online programs that can support your child, particularly in spelling. The thing about dyslexia and spelling is that our children with dyslexia have difficulty hearing the individual sounds in words. These are called our phonemes. And at the moment, we have a very phonic approach to teaching of spelling. But that happens to be the thing that our children, particularly our dyslexic learners, they really have difficulty hearing. So for example, if I were to say table without the t sound, you'd probably be able to tell me the word was able. But our dyslexic children often have such fine-tuned challenge hearing those individual sounds. It'd be very difficult for their brain to be able to process that. So what is very useful for some dyslexic learners, and again, every child's an individual, so you'd have to sort of see, is teaching them through rules and through anything that helps them to associate the spellings to, in terms of association. So things like mnemonics, some children are very good about mnemonics. So teaching them the word because could be big elephants can always understand small elephants, and then drawing, making it multi-sensory so that they're able to draw an elephant and a little elephant. So they've remembered B-E-C-A-U-S-E. So it's by using associations and following rules that helps some children to be able to apply their spellings. Oftentimes our dyslexic learners, they can do spelling tests. Sometimes they can get the 10 out of 10, but they won't be able to apply them in writing afterwards. But I'd be really happy if you would like to email us. I can give you some more tips and signpost you as well to some programs.
Great, thank you. We've got another question here about a little bit what you were talking about. So somebody's son has not being diagnosed with dyscalculia, but he has got ADHD and dyslexia. And he seems to have a problem with working memory. So it's very difficult for him to number order or to remember calculations or times tables. So the question is, how do I know if his problem is ADHD or if it's dyscalculia, or does it really matter? And then particularly the question is, because he's going to move, the parent is worried that when he moves from primary school into high school, will the support be different and when it's complicated?
Yes, I mean, working memory. So for those who are not aware of what working memory is, it's the ability to hold on and store information for the short, brief time whilst manipulating the information in some way. So short-term memory, short-term recall tends to be where it's 5 times 5 is 25. We've just been able to memorize that. And it's a very short-term recall. There's not much involved. Working memory is if we had 25 times 15. Not only do we do 5 times 5, but we've also got to remember those 2 10s. Then we've got to hold on. So whilst we're remembering something in the short term, we're also having to manipulate the information. So working memory is a very strong feature. It's one of the detecting features in ADHD. So it's very much part of ADHD. In fact, it's part of every one of these conditions. So working memory itself is not a diagnosable condition. Its features, it's part of our executive functioning, so our prefrontal cortex, but it features in every one of these conditions. So what we do is we say to our teaching teams that we need to make sure that our classrooms are working memory friendly. What we're trying to do is avoid cognitive overload, so working memory overload, because children and individuals who have got a limited working memory, they can only hold on information to so much information before that information is lost. And in mathematics, what tends to happen is that if we lose pieces of information, it's like we have to start back over again, because mathematics in particular is so cumulative. It's like building blocks. So what I would say there is that the working memory is likely to continue to be a feature of whatever diagnosis there is. And actually what you'd want to be communicating is, how do I support my child in their working memory challenges? And then you want to sort of pass that up on to the next teacher. So that is, again, something that we support, is the idea of handing over and transitioning information between teachers in year groups. It also really depends on whether the school team have got an awareness of what actually is cognitive overload and what is working memory. It tends to be something, particularly in the UK, that is very much part of teacher training nowadays. It wasn't 5 years ago. So it really depends on what the school is. But again, if you'd like to email us, there are some things that we could provide you with. These are the things you want to do to support working memory, which then, if possible, you can pass on to the next teacher, or even ask your child to, tell us which of those strategies work, and then they can advocate for themselves.
Yes, exactly, which becomes more and more important when they move from the primary environment, where it's very much, there's one adult who is their main advocate. When they move into the secondary school, then really it's very much more reliant on the parents and the child themselves to navigate the system and to work out the best way to learn for themselves. So
and we're working, and exactly, when we're working with families through transition, we always work really hard to find an advocate in the school, in the secondary school, so an ally for your child who's just there to be able to be there, working memory. Have you done have you got your homework in your bag? Have you got, all those sorts of things, somebody they can just touch base with.
We've actually come to the end of our time, Leo. We're quite happy to stay on for a couple more minutes just to cover any more questions, but we've got a question here from Celia, just saying, could we share some resources to help children with spelling and dyslexia. So I think that might be something that would definitely be for our next webinar, and we are putting more and more resources on our website. So our website has not got many resources on it yet, but we can definitely share some of those resources when we've put them online.
Yes, and we've got next one we can talk about reading and spelling within the dyslexia profile. And yes, our website's under construction, but it will have some downloadable booklets, particularly on reading and spelling. But again, if you want to just email us and let us know, then we can send you something in the meantime.
Yes, exactly. All right. So yes, we've come to the end of our time. If anybody has any other questions, then please do contact us on those details that we shared earlier. We're very happy to have initial calls with families, and we just need to know a little bit more about your child and the particular areas that you're concerned about. And then, we'd be very happy to see if there's some areas where we can guide you and maybe help you. So, thank you very much. Lisa, if you wanted to say a few words, then we'll hand back to Leo.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your time and attention. We are a little bit mission driven, and we are on the mission to create a space for families and for our children with neurodifferences to just be who they can be and to be their whole selves, and to be able to educate those adults, including school teachers, who support our children, to bring out the best of our children, to really adopt that strength-based lens, because we know now so much about what these various conditions in terms of what the strengths are and what kind of people they can be, despite the difficulties that they face. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, Lisa and Joanna. I do think spelling and in the dyslexia could be the next topic. Just in case some parents do not know, we will organize another webinar with Lisa and Joanna next month. We're trying to do it once per month, actually, related to different aspects and categories of SEN. So keep in touch, and then hopefully I'll see you next month then.
Great.
Thanks
very
much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye-bye.